Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research Centennial Commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the BASIS Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to research on minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. I'm Olena Palko, the co-convener of the study group, and today it is my great pleasure to welcome Martin Kysly and Charron, who will be talking to us today about the Crimean Tatars and the contested nature of Crimea. Martin, Austin, welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling us a little about yourself and how you became interested in Crimea, its history, and its people?
Yes, thank you, Olena. My name is Martin. I was born and raised in Crimea, so I'm Crimean myself. And but to be honest, I started my BA in history, and for 4 years I was doing research on just another topic, not Crimean at all. And only on my EMA program, I was interested in how what kind of childhood of Crimean Tatars and deportation was in exile. Because in the summer between my BA and EMA, I was traveling around Crimea, and in some steep area, I met an old man, and he told me, a Crimean Tatar man, and while drinking tea, he told me about his childhood in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan, and he said it was very strange and weird for him because he was born there, and he knew for sure that family is deported, and there was some diseases, famine, and other things like this. But at the same time, he mentioned all these palaces, old palaces of Samarkand. He was really they were astonishing for him. After this encounter, I was really interested in this topic of childhood of Crimean Tatars and exile and deportation. The first and second generation of those who were born there were born in exile. And after successfully finishing my EMA program, after defending my EMA thesis, I started my PhD program with another topic on an issue of how Crimean Tatars' identity was shaped, or rather reshaped, in exile. Why I started doing this research, the answer is pretty simple. While collecting oral histories, while recording interviews for my EMA thesis, I mentioned that Crimean Tatars, while talking about their childhood, they pay a lot of attention to how the image of Crimea played a great role in family narratives. How parents, while talking to their kids during dinner time or bedtime, paid a lot of attention to the lost homeland and the idea of return to the lost homeland, the idea to return to Crimea. And my idea was that Crimean Tatars identity, let us say in the modern Crimean Tatars identity, was reshaped in exile, and it was reshaped on the idea of coming back home, coming back to Crimea. At the same time, my PhD thesis is on slightly another topic. This is about the return of Crimean Tatars to exile, from exile to homeland under the Soviet ban, because as we know, Crimean Tatars were not allowed to return to Crimea before the collapse of Soviet Union. So what I'm doing in my PhD thesis is research and narratives of homeland and narratives of return. How Crimean Tatars remember, and how those practices of return looked like. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Austin Charron. I'm not from Crimea, I'm American, and so my interests, it's sort of a different angle. Just in Crimea, were born out of a general interest in the people and places of the former Soviet Union when I was in college, and in particular, regions that had experienced, either a separatist movement or some sort of ethnic, movements within the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And interested in places like Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, but also regions such as Crimea, which, from my perspective in the early 2000s, was a region that had not experienced a conflict like those other regions. It turned out we just had to wait a little longer for the conflict to reach Crimea. But I had a general interest in these regions and the different ethnic minorities across the former Soviet Union. And when I finished my undergraduate education, I received a Fulbright grant to study in Crimea, initially to look at questions of conflict or non-conflict at the time. But while I was there, I developed a keen interest in Crimean regional identity, which I really picked up on a lot while being there. The sense of being from Crimea, being Crimean, expressed by both Crimean Tatars, but also ethnic Ukrainians, Russians, and other minorities in Crimea itself. So this ended up being the topic of my MA thesis, looking at the questions of Crimean regional identity and how it's expressed by different ethnic minorities there. And following, this was in 2011 when I did field work in Crimea for this thesis, and 2012 by the time I finished the thesis. And of course, just a couple years later was 2014 was the annexation of Crimea. And as I went into my doing my PhD dissertation, I had to refocus and think about what identity looked like for those from Crimea who are now internally displaced to mainland Ukraine. So I returned to mainland Ukraine for fieldwork in 2015 and 2016 to do ethnographic fieldwork among those from Crimea who are now living in places like Kiev or Lviv, and looking at questions of their identity and how it had shifted and what it means now to be both Crimean or Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian at the same time. So I'm a geographer. I'm coming at this from a sort of a social and political geographic perspective, but this is sort of my long journey to developing an interest in Crimea and Crimean Tatars.
Thank you both. Could we perhaps start with some historical background? For the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us a bit about the origin of the Crimean Tatars, how the Russian Empire came to Crimea, and how Crimea became part of Russia?
I thought I could speak a bit first quickly to what we might call the ethnogenesis of the Crimean Tatars, so how they developed as a distinctive ethnic community. As some listeners may know, Crimea is a place historically of great diversity and of great, contestation, you might say. It's a place that has been colonized and conquered and settled by many different peoples over millennia, from Scythians and Circassians and all these, nomadic peoples who had come through and occupied the steppe region of northern Crimea. Some went into the mountains, some along the coast. You have influences from Turkey, from Greece, from Armenia. You have a lot of different peoples that have sort of found a home within Crimea, going back millennia. And at the time of, in the mid, was it the 1600s, or going back even earlier, 1400s, at the time when the Ottomans sort of develop a influence over the Crimean region, and Islam becomes the predominant religion there, following also the occupation of Crimea by the Mongols and the Golden Horde. You have a time when Islam sort of predominates over the Crimean Peninsula, and you begin to have a syncretism of all the different peoples that have sort of found their way to Crimea over the centuries and their descendants. And under the authority of the Giray dynasty, which is a descendant of the Golden Horde, you begin to have sort of a unified Crimean Tatarness that begins to form, a sense that that the people here are from Crimea, share something in their language, their identity, and in their religious unity within Crimea among the Crimean Tatars.
Thank you, Austin. Yes, Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of Crimean Peninsula, and it's really complicated to figure out who was the first, because there are some sedentarian element, like agricultures that were in Crimea long before the Mongol nomads came to the peninsula. Moreover, if we are talking about nomads, it's first of all the northern part of Crimea, not the mountain region, not the coastal region. So yes, the Crimea in each and every time, and especially in Middle Ages, it was a melting pot for a lot of ethnic groups and a lot of cultures. Probably the culmination of it was the Crimean Khanate, how it was established, and probably the most important thing from our perspective from nowadays is that Crimean Tatars believe that Crimean Khanate was the first state of Crimean Tatars people. And I believe on this point we can talk on how the Russian Empire came to Crimea. And it's really interesting because talking from present day point of view, how we can see it, it can be called without any doubts a successful special operation. Yeah, because now we can see in our news, or not only news, just from our window, that Russian special operation is so successful. But by the end of the 18th century, Russian Empire did pretty the same thing as 8 years ago, a kind of referendum for independence, and just it was the first annexion. Austin?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about sort of the perception of what Crimea was and what it meant to sort of the Tsar's empire at the time. This being the late sort of 18th century, 1770s, 1780s, at a time when there are many other European colonial empires going out and colonizing other parts of the world, and at a time when the Tsarist empire was interested in being among the echelon of great European empires, and were looking to conquer their own territories. And at that point, Crimea held a certain appeal and believed as this exotic orientalized place, home to Muslim people, home to a people that appeared exotic, and a landscape that appeared exotic to from the perspective of St. Petersburg, especially. And so there was also a certain element of, we might call Hellenophilism, or love of Greek culture, right? Because Crimea was connected to Greece, both in terms of it was a place of early Greek colonization. From the ancient Greece had city-states and its colonies in Crimea. And there's also this myth that Orthodox Christianity was passed to the Russian lands via Volodymyr the Great's baptism into the church in Crimea, supposedly in the year 988, which then linked it to the development of Orthodox Christianity in the Byzantine period of Greek history. So there were these two threads of sort of Greek love for Greek culture that existed in the Russian aristocracy at the time, that also made Crimea appear this very valuable prize, that they could possess this sort of conduit to Greek culture that sort of reified their own greatness in a way. So there's these two elements of colonial interest in expanding the territory and capturing this important territory that's important culturally, historically, but also strategically, you might say, because of its access to the Black Sea, right? So there are a lot of elements here that make Crimea a very appealing piece of territory for an aspiring empire such as the Russian Empire, although at that time it was already a large empire. And we'll note, just as a historical bit of interesting, to place this into historical context, that the formal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Empire happened right around the same time that it first began to colonize Alaska. So if to go somewhere that's very close but also very far, it sort of gives a better context to the idea of Crimea being something inherently Russian and deeply embedded in Russian culture, as many tend to think of it as.
I really like the concept of settlers colonialism and how it can be applied to Crimea. My colleague Max Svezhentsov, he defended his PhD thesis on Crimea after the collapse of Soviet Union, but in his chapter 1 of his dissertation, he is elaborating on how the first annexion of Crimea was an example of settler colonialism. And the idea of colonization and bringing the light of civilization to some barbarians, some wild people, uncivilized, and unable. Oh yeah, the most interesting thing that emerged in the 18th century and then in 2014, peoples that unable to govern themselves. So you need to bring them not only the light, but to govern them. And all these rhetorics that you, Austin, mentioned about how the myth of Russian Crimea was forged, how it appeared. This myth, I believe it's by its nature, it's a settler's myth, because it's a justification or just an explanation of colonial policy. And the 19th century history of Crimea with, let's call it non-violent deportation of Crimean Tatars, how Crimean Tatars left Crimea for some reasons, economical, religious, and political. Is a good example of the settler colonialism.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And I think a sort of a post-colonial lens is absolutely crucial to understanding Crimea, but also, the Russian Empire and Soviet Empire and the Russian Federation nowadays. I think, that's an easier concept for people to grasp now, given the current war in Ukraine and what's really come down to. But looking at Crimea, especially when you start to understand it as a settler colony of the Russian Empire, you really start to see how much its history parallels that of other parts of the world that were colonized by other European powers. So I think it's a very important context to consider, and I think it's a perspective that should be promoted more and investigated more among those interested in Crimea, especially.
It's in general very interesting how the history of Eastern Europe and especially Crimea were paid so little of interest through the lens of post-colonial history, and how now, just now, we can take a look and open for ourselves some aspects. And you, Austin, told us about your interest in this topic. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people you told about your sphere of interest, they thought that you started your research just because of the annexion of Crimea, like after 2014, yeah? I know, because for me, it's very obvious. A lot of them are asking, oh, you started your PhD because of the annexion of Crimea, yeah?
We'll back a little further than that, but yeah, I've certainly changed the story, changed what I was looking at after that. But yeah, my interest goes back.
Yeah,
farther than that.
The same is our vision of Crimea, how we changed our lens, and only now it's helping us finally to see some useful things. Yeah, thank you.
So I would like to continue a little bit with the historical background and ask you about the Soviet period in Crimea, especially the interwar period. This was the period of the so-called Korenizatsiya, the nationalities policy that aimed to root the Soviet regime in the peripheries, but at the same time it implied that ethnic diversities were promoted, national languages were supported, and so on and so on. So I'd like to ask you, what were the policies of the Soviet regime towards the Crimean Tatar during the interwar period? Because we know that Crimea remained a part of, became the part of Russia after the civil war. And what was the status and place of the Crimean Tatars in the hierarchy of ethnicities in the Soviet Union? Especially in this context of colonialism and post-colonialism that you started discussing.
Yeah, I mean, just generally, you could say, about its general position, right? Crimea entered the Soviet Union after the Civil War as a part of the RSFSR, right? The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, and it entered as an autonomous republic. So, there are many of these across the Soviet Union throughout its history that were homelands for smaller minorities that didn't sort of constitute the larger, the larger minorities or ethnic communities that made up the Union republics, but there were many of these smaller autonomous republics that were created for the sake of smaller ethnic minorities that lived there. And even though at the time Crimea was already home to many non-Crimean Tatars, many Russians and other Slavic peoples, it was still created as an autonomous republic for the sake of this, indigenous ethnic community. And so, under the policies of Korenizatsiya, yes, it's ethnic, the trappings of its ethnic identity, its language, and its dance, and these things were sort of codified and promoted, much as they were in other contexts across the Soviet Union at the time.
I believe we need to mention how the Crimea became the Soviet Republic. I mean to mention the revolution process, because in Crimea it was the process was pretty the same like in other part of Russian Empire, but at the same time there was some special character. The peer of the Krutai, kind of Congress of Crimean Tatars. And the most interesting thing that the Krutai, headed by Numan Shlibjihan, he was the head of executive committee or Majlis. The whole design of Crimean state was based on an idea of different ethnic cultures and how can they develop themselves in on a peninsula, on one small territory. Unfortunately, all this idea was just ruined by Bolsheviks. But talking about the 20s, about the Soviet period, there is an idea that the colonization of Crimea was started by the reason of not only whitewash the reputation of Bolsheviks in Crimea, and not only for the reason of emancipation and modernization of Crimean Tatars, but just because the so-called bourgeoisie element, Crimean Tatar nationalists were still pretty strong in Crimea. And first of all, if you talk about intelligentsia, the intelligentsia that were just killed during the Great Terror by Stalin in the second part of 30s. So it wasn't so easy at all how Crimea became the part of how it was integrated in the Soviet Union, because the Red Terror that we know, it was first of all something that we know from Crimean history.
That's good, important historical context, right, about the lead up to the Civil War and what it meant in Crimea, that there had been this, long development of a Crimean Tatar national identity, national movement, which sort of came to a head there in a very turbulent Civil War period, where there was for a brief period an independent Tatar republic declared within Crimea, led, as Martin said, by Numan Shlibjihan, who then was murdered by the incoming Bolsheviks, and then Crimea was like sort of a hot potato, a contested area throughout the Civil War. Notoriously, briefly, was the sort of last stand for the White Army and many of the Russian aristocracy before fleeing across the Black Sea. So, as it has been throughout much of its history, it was highly contested throughout this period.
Thank you. Moving forward, perhaps one of the very few things that, apart from today's events, that people, the wider audience would know about is the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from the peninsula during the Second World War. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the deportation, the motivation of the Soviet leadership, why they decided to deport the entire community from the Crimean Peninsula, especially given those policies of the interwar years. Martin, you've mentioned about those bourgeois elements, those assumed bourgeois elements, and those nationalists. How, will you see any continuity in this process? Those purges of the 1930s and then the deportation of 1944. Martin, perhaps you could start.
Yes, thank you. The official reason for deportation of Crimean Tatars from official Soviet reason was the cooperation of Crimean Tatars with Germans during the occupation of Crimea. It's pretty obvious that the whole nation cannot cooperate in mass. I mean, elders, children, and women, all of them. But it was the official reason put it on a paper in May 1944. Yes, there is a kind of connection because, of course, the cooperation was present in Crimea during the occupation time. And one of the reasons for it was that Crimean Tatars were extremely unsatisfied with Soviet rule, as in other parts of Soviet Union, all over the Soviet Union, and especially where German occupation forces were present. So yes, probably the first reason for cooperation is the Red Terror and Great Terror, how Soviet entered Crimea and how Soviets ruled the Crimea, and how the Crimean Tatar national idea was just ruined during the interwar period. At the same time, it should be mentioned that a lot of Crimean Tatars were fighting in Red Army. Were fighting against Germans with the Soviet Union. Moreover, during the occupation of Crimea, a lot of Crimean Tatars were present in guerrilla squads and partisans, which were situated first of all in Crimean mountains, the region traditionally populated by Crimean Tatars, first of all, and it was the reason why Germans were so angry at Crimean Tatars, because usually they try to help Soviet partisans as much as they can. So rather, we need to talk not about official reason, but intention. And there are a lot of versions. Some of them are extremely exotic. From my point of view, the most reasonable one, if we can talk in categories of reason while we are talking about deportations of the whole nation, is to clear the border, to clear the frontier, because the Crimea is facing the Black Sea, it's a northern Black Sea region, probably because of the same reason that Meskhetian Turks were deported from the borderland. I'm not sure if really there was any. I'm not a historian of the Second World War. I'm not even sure there was any threat of Turkey attacking Soviet Union, but probably it may be the reason why all those peoples were those peoples became so-called punished.
Agree with what Martin said. Just to follow up on some of those points, yes, I think obviously the official reason given by Soviet authorities was the supposed collaboration of the Crimean Tatars with the Nazi Germans during their occupation of Crimea in World War II. And as Martin did point out, right, there were, many thousands of Crimean Tatars operating in the Red Army, fighting against Germany and in the partisan movement. So it's really kind of, an arbitrary thing to declare that the Crimean Tatars were collectively responsible for collaboration with the Germans. And I also agree with Martin's point that it's more likely has to do with the fact that Crimea was a border region, that it was just across the Black Sea from Turkey in particular, where Crimean Tatars had a strong, cultural and religious and historical connection and affinity. And so there's a fear that there could be, if Turkey had some sort of goals or aims on to move on to Crimea, to try to annex it, to try to take territory, that they would have this sort of third column issue among the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And if you look at the history of the deported peoples of the Soviet Union, so many of them do come from border regions. I think this is sort of a trend you see, as Martin mentioned, the Meskhetian Turks, but also, Latvians, other Baltic peoples, Poles, and, Koreans out in the Far East. And so there's a general paranoia, I think, it's in the Stalinist period, especially, that these minorities that were maybe beyond the control of Russia a little bit, and didn't share the ethnic ties to the Russian core, that they could be a problem if there were other there was some sort of border conflicts and that they needed to sort of remove them from the borders to prevent these sort of issues from coming up. So I think that's probably the most likely explanation for why they went through with the complete deportation of the Crimean Tatars in particular.
It should be mentioned that this fear of Crimean Tatars joining their brothers in Islam, Turks, it was present before, during the Crimean War in 19th century too, to be honest. And talking about the deportation, it should be mentioned that in vast majority of narratives of deported Crimean Tatars and their recollections of deportation, they're talking about injustice. Moreover, a lot of them saying that for a couple of years, probably 2-3 years, first years in exile, some of them were they didn't unpack their stuff because there was strong belief that some kind of mistake happened and they're going to be returned back to Crimea. Some of them even wrote some letters to Stalin, to Kalinin, to Beria, to somebody else. And I believe it's a good example of that collaboration wasn't a real reason for deportation, because Crimean Tatars were just shocked with this statement.
Thank you. Moving on to the experience of deportation itself, or the life in deportations. You mentioned that both of your interests started actually with the Crimean Tatars in deportation, so outside of Crimea. And I just wanted to ask you about their experiences and how close or distinctive did they find themselves in comparison to other punished people? Were there any attempts to collaborate, say, with other Tatar punished or deported from Russia itself? How did those people leave all those 60 years before they were allowed to return to Ukraine? Perhaps 50, sorry.
Should be mentioned, yeah, Crimean Tatars and other punished people were put in so-called special settlements, spецпоселения. It was a regular village or even a town, but you were not allowed to leave it because it was special settlement. Probably it was even harsh to be there because you are living with other ordinary people, I mean locals, but they can leave and you cannot. The special settlements regime, it was cancelled after the death of Stalin. So officially, after the death of Stalin, others punished people, they were allowed to return to their homelands, but not Crimean Tatars and not Meskhetian Turks. They stayed in exile for, till the collapse of the Soviet Union. And talking about exile, about deportation, how they found themselves, the major part of Crimean Tatars happened to be in Uzbekistan. And as I know, only Koreans, Germans, and Meskhetian Turks were in Uzbekistan too, because Baltic people, Ukrainians, both, they were in Kazakhstan. And yes, those informants I talked to about the deportation years, they are saying that there was some feeling of understanding between different groups of punished people, deported people, and they were feeling the same injustice.
I'll add that a little bit more about, I guess, the geography of the deportation. As Martin mentioned, the vast majority of the Crimean Tatars that were deported were sent to Uzbekistan, with smaller groups that ended up in other parts of Central Asia and even in the Urals and Siberia. So they spread them out a little bit, but the vast majority were concentrated in Uzbekistan. And it's my understanding that I think a lot of the motivation was this idea that, you know, they'd be sent to live among a group that shared a religion, right? That there's some religious commonalities, that they spoke not the same language, but Turkic languages that were similar enough that they, you know, that with time, the hope was, as I understand, that Crimean Tatars would sort of begin to just disappear and dissolve as a distinctive ethnic community and sort of become Uzbeks, more or less, right? That there would be a sort of a host community that they could, that would, you know, would take them in and then just, you know, absorb them that way. But it's the remarkable thing about the Crimean Tatars, I think, is that they really resisted this, that they held tenacious to their ethnic identity of exile, never once gave up on the dream of being able to return. I mean, sure, there's probably some who did sort of follow this path that the Soviet authorities envisioned, that it sort of, you know, dissolved, became more or less locals in a way, but the leadership of the Crimean Tatars and sort of the core group were determined not to let this happen, and to hold on to their identity, and to ultimately, you know, returning to Crimea being the ultimate goal and the ultimate objective of this community. But they spent decades fighting for it.
It can even be supposed that Crimean Tatars were used by Soviet after the favor of this idea that Crimean Tatars will just disappear among Uzbeks, among locals. I believe from some point of view, Crimean Tatars were used like a weapon of a colonizer to colonize Uzbeks, because Crimean Tatars, it may sound a little bit weird, but from some point of view, they were more civilized from the Soviet point of view than Uzbeks. They came from a European part of the Soviet Union, not the Central Asia. They were much more emancipated and modernized through the colonization process, because, to be honest, in Central Asia, the colonization was just a big failure, because some riots and guerrilla squads were present in Uzbekistan, I believe, till the middle of 30s. This Basmachi movement. And Crimean Tatars came to Uzbekistan with this absolutely different model of religion and understanding of their place. And talking in the terms of colonial theory, Crimean Tatars not only saved their identity, they even reshaped it in these circumstances. It's pretty much important, because after the 1967, Crimean Tatars succeed to start returning to Crimea under the Soviet ban. It was extremely difficult, because in Crimea they were not allowed to buy houses, to buy any kind of. Moreover, they were not allowed to. Locals were not hiring them, and militia were checking their propiska registration very often. So they were just out of law, and for this reason, there was such a phenomenon like a second deportation, as Crimean Tatars is naming them, because all the time they were forcefully put it out of Crimea, to Kherson region in Ukraine, and to Krasnodar region in Russia. Yes, and I argue that all this process happened because of this strong identity based on Crimea.
I hadn't heard that perspective before about the Crimean Tatar sort of being used as a tool of colonization in Uzbekistan, but I really like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'll just add that, you know, part of this was after the deportation, Crimean Tatars were scrubbed from the official list of nationalities within the Soviet Union. So there was definitely an intention to sort of erase Crimean Tatars off the map, which is ironic considering, you know, this is what Martin just mentioned, as they try to make their way back to Crimea themselves, even though their nationality doesn't officially exist on the books in the Soviet Union, they're still identified as Crimean Tatars and as you know, persona non grata within Crimea itself. So yeah, you know, when the freedom of movement was allowed for them within the Soviet Union, many of them did just, you know, I'm just going back to Crimea and try to stay there. And many of them, you know, were then pushed back out. And as Martin mentioned, many of them ended up just sort of settling down to the north of Crimea, in the Kherson, east, and the Krasnodar region, sort of, you know, posed and ready to move back into Crimea if and when the opportunity allowed them to, if and when their ban from living Crimea ended. So yeah, throughout this period, there's sort of a lot of anticipation and attempts to try to move back.
I wanted to ask you a practical question about passports. Did they have passports in Uzbekistan? If they had passports, like Soviet passports, what nationality would be there recorded? And could they? Because I would assume coming back to Ukraine, you would need to have some identity documents. So how did it work? Go ahead, Martin.
Previously, you put it a question about how they encountered these other Tatars. And yeah, there are a lot of other Tatars in Soviet Union and Russian Empire, Kazan Tatars, Bashkortostan Tatars, and even in Uzbekistan, there is some ethnic group called Tatars. So yes, after the deportation, long before the deportation, as Austin mentioned, the Crimean Tatars were just deleted from the official list of nationalities in Soviet Union. So, and after the deportation, they became just Tatars, not Crimean Tatars. So in their passport, they got, after the death of Stalin, the nationality was put it as Tatar. How, for example, Crimean militia used to know that there is a Crimean Tatar, not a Kazan Tatar. Those passports had a mention that the owner of a passport was previously a settler of a special settlement. And yeah, that definitely was the reason how the passport of Crimean Tatars looked like.
Thank you. Then you've mentioned already that starting in the 1980s, the Crimean Tatars started to return en masse. There were indeed, as you said, Martin, there were those who returned even during the ban. But in the late 1980s, after almost 45 years of exile, around 280,000 Crimeans returned to Crimea. What were the main challenges for them on the peninsula, which had by now become part of Ukraine?
Probably the most challengeable part was Crimean Communist Party nomenclatura that didn't want to see any Crimean Tatars in Crimea. If to look through the official documents, the idea may appear that Crimean Tatars were not allowed to return to Crimea after the death of Stalin just because of a Crimean Communist Party nomenclatura. So even in 50s and 60s, when this question was raised up in Moscow, it looks like the official party, the position of a Crimean Communist Party branch was accepted. That's why when during the perestroika, during the liberation process in Soviet Union, by the end of 80s, Crimean Tatars started to return to Crimea. And there was even a decree of Supreme Soviet Union Council about punished people and in general, and about Crimean Tatars. Even after this declaration was issued, the local government in Crimea didn't welcome Crimean Tatars in Crimea at all. It was very, to be honest, the struggle started in Crimea. The struggle pretty violent because, as I know, working this KGB archive of Ukraine, this gas that we know used by riot police, it was first used in Soviet Union in Crimea against Crimean Tatars by the end 80s. And such a widely known the phenomena of self-immolation among Crimean Tatars. The first case was in Samamut in 70s, but by the end of 80s and the start of 90s, it was extremely widespread in Crimea. Because the main reason was to protect themselves from local militia, local riot police, and local Communist Party members. Why there was a struggle? It was a struggle for land. First of all, for land, because Crimean Tatars didn't have a possibility to buy land during perestroika and economic crisis, Soviet Union. So they were trying to obtain some parts of a free land around the Crimea. And the local government was extremely against it. And it's pretty long story. I'm not sure if I can finish. So Austin, probably you can add something.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit. Speaking to the point that you brought up about sort of the apprehension among the sort of Crimean ruling elite of the returning Crimean Tatars, and I think I've heard the argument made that the restoration of Crimea's autonomy in 1991, it was a unique case in the Soviet Union, as just before the collapse, that there was a referendum held in order to reestablish the autonomous status of Crimea, which had been lost in 1945, shortly after the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. And so there was this put to a vote to reestablish autonomy. But as I said, I've heard the argument made that this was sort of an attempt by the largely ethnic Russian ruling elites there to sort of gain some control over policy in Crimea in order to sort of prevent Crimean Tatars from being able to obtain land and to get jobs and to reestablish themselves within the peninsula. So there's these sort of big attempts in order to gird against the returning Crimean Tatars among the ethnic Russians and the Russian ruling elite there. And so you do have the Crimean Tatars now officially allowed to start returning beginning around 1988, and they start coming in droves. Not all of them come back. Some stayed behind in Uzbekistan and elsewhere, right? They've established their lives there, and not all were willing to uproot themselves again. But many did. Many came back to find that, right, their former homes and lands were now occupied, as they'd lost them over 60 years earlier. And so the big struggle was really to get land, as mentioned. And so what became the sort of cliche, or the thing you see, and something that became visible across many parts of Crimea, was the so-called samozakhvat, or self-settlement, where Crimean Tatars would just basically start occupying, on the unoccupied land, that land taken from collective farms, stuff that was sort of falling apart at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and basically building a small shack to begin with, just a small, crude, simple settlement that they could claim residency in. And there was a policy that after so much time spent occupying that land, that they could then claim ownership for it. So there's a sort of long-term policy to start building communities, start building homes and neighborhoods of Crimean Tatars that they could then build out, and this would be their method of sort of reestablishing themselves in the peninsula. And so you see this primarily around larger cities like in Simferopol, in the capital. You see there's now many neighborhoods all around the city that started this way. They're now, where the majority of the Crimean Tatars live. Before the deportation, many of the Crimean Tatars had lived on the southern coast, which was now, the playground of the Russian elite. It's the place where all the Soviet workers went on vacation. The land was so valuable that there was really nothing for them to try to reclaim. So they're really boxed out of that really valuable, really desirable land, and ended up in the steppe regions more predominantly. And so there's a shift in the geography and where Crimean Tatars live as they return compared to prior to the deportation.
Talking about the repatriation of Crimean Tatars, we also need to mention that Crimean Tatars succeeded in their political activity after return to Crimea with renewing of Kurultai, the first Kurultai after the 1970s, and with establishment of Majlis as executive committee of Crimean Tatars people. And probably we can say for sure that Crimean Tatars became a pretty visible power in Crimea. So Ukrainian government, as well as some pro-Russian forces in Crimea, they needed to take into account Crimean Tatars all the time. So yes, at this point we can say that Crimean Tatars during the independence history of Ukraine were a pro-Ukrainian force in Crimea, trying to balance these pro-Russian narratives and practices.
Thank you. Building on this, indeed, the Crimean Tatars, they have been Kyiv's main allies on the peninsula, especially if compared to ethnic Russians. But how did this allegiance change since 2014? And what political choices did Crimean Tatar face since the occupation of the peninsula? And most recently, what is the position of the Crimean Tatars, those on the peninsula and now in mainland Ukraine, on the war, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I'll speak a little bit first to this question. Ukraine, something I investigated a lot in my fieldwork. And I'd say that, initially when the Crimean Tatars began returning, they were returning to a Crimea that had, in their absence, been transferred to Ukraine, as you mentioned. That transfer happened in 1954. And so they're arriving to a Crimea that's now, tied to Ukraine, by government, by administration, and by, culture in some ways. And so this is sort of a novel thing, right? There's some historical interactions between Crimean Tatars and Cossacks and other early Ukrainian groups, but this was the first time that they were really on territory that was linked to Ukraine officially. And so there was sort of some process of sort of figuring this out as they arrived, but they they determined that Ukraine was an ally for them, right? That they're up against this crumbling empire led by the Russians, who have been their historical colonizers and oppressors. And so I think they see initially as teaming up with Ukraine and supporting Ukrainian sovereignty in the process as the Soviet Union is on the verge of breaking up, and sort of aligning with Kiev as their best bet initially, right? That there isn't necessarily a strong cultural affinity developed yet with Ukraine, I'd say, but that strategically these were the partners that made sense, that these are going to help them, the Ukrainian authorities are going to help them reestablish their ties and their connection to Crimea and help them rebuild their lives there. But as what started out as sort of this strategic alliance, I would say, over the decades of Ukrainian independence, has truly developed for Crimean Tatars into a genuine sense of civic national identity, right? Especially the younger generation, those who were born just before returning to Crimea, in exile still, or born in Crimea itself, sort of the first generation born again on Crimean soil after the deportation. There's a genuine sense, just through the usual processes of nation building and education and language development and travel within the country. There's a real strong understanding among the Crimean Tatar youth, but increasingly among the older generations too, that they have become a part of this sort of political or civic nation of Ukraine. And that, even leading up to 2014, that had already been a strong feeling. And then, the events of the Revolution of Dignity and the 2014 annexation of Crimea have just sort of served to solidify that view among many Crimean Tatars. And so you've seen a lot of Crimean Tatars, especially younger Crimean Tatars, leave the peninsula for mainland Ukraine since 2014, with places like Kiev and Lviv becoming major centers of sort of the Crimean Tatar diaspora, if you want to call them that. And there you see a lot of young Crimean Tatars taking up important positions now in government, in culture, in the business side of things. You see a lot of Crimean Tatar restaurants popping up in some of these major cities. You see some major government positions filled by Crimean Tatars now. And so you've seen the acceleration of the integration of Crimean Tatars into the Ukrainian political state, I would say. Maybe I could talk more, but I'll let Martin add something here.
Yes, you're right about, despite the fact that a lot of Ukrainian dissidents were helping Crimean Tatars national movement during the Soviet period, and there were a lot of strong connection between both movements, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars, under the Soviet ban. Despite this fact, Crimean Tatars were pretty skeptical toward Ukrainian after they returned to Crimea, because their homeland became Ukraine. But as it turned out later, Kiev became the main ally for Crimean Tatars, even more than, talking in categories of some historical myths, even more than Istanbul in Turkey, to put it right. The question about Crimea and Crimean Tatars after the annexion of Crimea, after the 2015, is extremely complicated, because we are really lacking sources, really working data, and even thoughts of ordinary people from Peninsula, and even those who you can reach. I mean, some family relatives, friends you can reach through Facebook or any other kind of messenger. They're afraid to talk. And they were afraid to talk from the very beginning of occupation of Crimea. As I know, there are two sociological surveys that were taking place in Crimea. One is official, but by Levada Center, Moscow sociologist, and another one by some Crimean Tatars researchers. It was in a form of confidential focus group, and according to results, we can see the Crimean Tatars they're changing after the occupation of Crimea, but pretty slowly, and they're still there is still a feeling of Kyiv as a center of the mental map. There is still this feeling, despite the fact that some of them are starting their education, work in Kazan, in Krasnodar, in Moscow. The Kyiv is still the mental center. And just 4 years ago, I believe, I visited Crimea, and I stopped next to the small grocery shop, and I entered it, and the man who was keeping it was Crimean Tatar. He saw my number plates in the car, and he said, "Oh, when are you going to come back to us? We are missing you a lot." So yes, while visiting Crimea, you can hear a lot of like this. People are really missing, and I believe there is some common for Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, not only in historical traumas of deportation and Holodomor, but probably a common thing is the loss of home, because for some reason the annexion of Crimea by Russian Federation is a loss of home, not only for those Crimean Tatars who left the Crimea because of persecution, it was also a loss of home for those who stayed there, because it's not feeling like home anymore. And the same for Ukrainians, it doesn't feel like Ukrainian Crimea anymore. So this common thing is why in a base for this mutual connection.
I think you could sort of speak about maybe what we could call like a post-colonial solidarity among ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, who both suffered at the hands of Russian oppressors. I think that is easier for people to grasp right now, given everything we've seen in the last five months of war. We really start to see, this thread of imperialism and oppression running through Russia's history, and especially in its relationship to Ukraine and Crimea. And so there's comparing the deportation and the Holodomor, these two events, there's great suffering on the level of the whole nation at the hands of Russian oppressors. I think is a bond that helps strengthen the relationship between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. And as Martin says, there's this loss of home. Now I think maybe even as we see more Ukrainians lose their home at the hands of invading Russians, that bond may even grow stronger. So there's it's ongoing, the way that this bond is developing.
Thank you. We are unfortunately running out of time, so I'll just ask you one last question. If you could perhaps recommend some key readings for our listeners, where can people go to learn more about this topic?
There is a course issued by Ukrainian Institute. The course is on a platform, Udemy platform. It was issued just a month ago. The course is titled Crimea, People in History. And the course is looking on the Crimean history and through the lens of the genius people, Crimean Tatars. It's a short course with lectures like 10 minutes, but it's pretty good in general understanding. And I believe there should be a reading list at the end of each and every lesson. And talking about reading, I can recommend probably Brian Williams with his books on genesis of Crimean Tatars and forging of Crimean Tatars identity, talking on deportation and struggle for return. The Gunnar's Bekirova book. I'm not sure it's translated into English. It probably should be translated into French, but I'm not sure about English at all. And probably the last one will be Greta Siulin, Beyond the Map, about how the memory of deportation, the memory of exile influenced Crimean Tatars return a lot.
I would definitely repeat Martin's recommendation of Beyond Memory by Greta Siulin. That's a really important text for understanding the experience of Crimean Tatars and deportation, especially. Also, as you mentioned, Brian Glynn Williams' work is rather extensive on the ethnogenesis of Crimean Tatars. Another work that's been pretty crucial for me, from my understanding, is Gwendolyn Sasse's book, The Crimea Question, which doesn't focus just on Crimean Tatars, but sort of Crimea generally. If I can do a bit of self-promotion, I suppose I do have a chapter in the new volume that Olena, that you co-edited, right, Making Ukraine. A chapter is on the sort of how Crimea entered Ukraine and how it's, the story behind its transfer to Ukraine in 1954. I've published several articles related to Crimea and Crimean Tatars. If you're really interested in checking them out, they are listed, linked from. I have a personal website, austincharron.com, so Charron.com. In the publication section there, if anybody's interested, I have them linked there. I won't mention each of them, but they're there.
Thank you. We'll put those links in the description of this episode. Thank you very much, Austin and Martin, for your time, and thank you for these fascinating insights that really help us understand better the events of today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.